Hi everyone, my name is Robert Veen. Welcome to the Hegel Courses channel, the channel that tries to understand and explain and exposit the philosophy of Hegel, and this year in particular Hegel's social philosophy. Before we get into the social philosophy, I need to say something about Hegel's method of thinking, its so-called speculative dialectics. And I already made a little explainer video of about 6 minutes. The first part is already on the channel, but we need to go into the text that we read in that introductory video a little bit more, and that is what I'm going to do. Today, we're going to take a look at the first paragraph of the so-called Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, which had many editions. I'm taking this from the English translation of the 1830 edition of the Encyclopedia, and we're going to dive into the first paragraph of that book, the first paragraph, which is actually the introduction to the whole of the Encyclopedia, and it talks in this first paragraph about the peculiarities of Hegel's method, his approach to philosophy, and we will see that that amounts indeed to a problem. And the problem is this: how can a philosophy start if it sets out without any presuppositions? How can we do philosophy without presuppositions? That is a demand actually that came from the period of the Enlightenment. You shouldn't have presuppositions in your philosophies. Philosophy should be a totally autonomous way of understanding the world and understanding truth. And if it's totally autonomous, it cannot start with something that is already given. The great critique of medieval philosophy that was developed during the Enlightenment years is that medieval philosophy and many other types of philosophy later presupposed revelation. Christian philosophy presupposed Christian revelation, Jewish philosophy, the Jewish revelation, and so there was always an absolute presupposition in those kinds of philosophies. Hegel sets out to, according to the demands of the Enlightenment, Hegel sets out to give a version of philosophy that has no presuppositions. But that's a problem. How can you start a philosophy without presuppositions? We will see at the end of this discussion that Hegel actually says, well, we have to start with the notion of being without presuppositions. Or maybe you can put it even in the opposite way by saying we have to start with the presupposition that is necessary. We cannot evade that presupposition. And that presupposition will turn out to be the first great category of the logic, which is then being. Being is the presupposition of everything. Well, if it's the presupposition that is necessary, you can't evade it, then that presupposition, i.e. being, means simply givenness of whatever shape or form. Immanuel Kant said being is like a position in thought, is a position in thought. It's the thought that you have, simply the existence of that thought. So that's a presupposition. We cannot start thinking without making this preposition that we are actually thinking. And what then is it what we're thinking? If we don't presume any kind of contents, if we don't have a presupposition of some sort of content, then that presupposition can only be expressed as being, immediate being, without anything further. So that is the way he will work this out in the beginning of the logic. That will not matter so much to us in this course because we're talking about social philosophy. Let me tell you something first about the position of social philosophy in the Encyclopedia, because what Hegel is actually doing, he's giving an overview of all the different philosophical disciplines that there are. For instance, anthropology, for instance, the philosophy of right, which is actually social philosophy, the philosophy of art, the philosophy of religion, The only thing missing in this encyclopedia is the philosophy of history. That has a reason, and that will I will try to explain that further on in this course. So we need to talk about the method of Hegel's philosophy, and we'll find something about that method, the necessity of the method, as he will explain it later in this first paragraph of the encyclopedia. I said the first part of the encyclopedia, the first paragraph of that first part, because the encyclopedia has 3 parts. We start with the method itself. What Hegel calls the logic is the first part of the encyclopedia, deals with method. Now, it deals with method not in the way we are accustomed to. He's not talking formally about the method, but he's actually giving us a total view of all the categories that we use to explain the world and to communicate about the world with one another, like the concept of being, like the concept of becoming, like number, like essence, like the concept of the concept is itself. All of these categories have a certain structure, and the structure begins very simple, concept of being. Ultimately, we reach at the end of this development of ideas. Why it is a development, I will explain that later. But at the end of the development of that idea of being, we wind up with the notion of the idea. The idea is the fullness of our logical thought, and it's the fullness of the way we talk to one another about reality. 3 parts, I said. So the first is about method, which is called the logic. The second part is about the presuppositions of that logic, because if there is no actual being that uses logic, that has a conversation with others about reality, logic has no meaning at all. So logic is grounded in something or someone that is actually using that logic. Hegel will develop, again, from the most simple category up to and including the most complex category, everything that belongs to what he calls nature. So nature is the material basis on which logic actually rests. In reality, there is no logic. No logic can be applied without ultimately a human being that understands himself and his reality and expresses that reality in words and concepts. So the second part is the philosophy of nature. And ultimately, at the end of the philosophy of nature, we get to the anthropology, the science of anthropology, which is all about the material being of humans. Well, at the end of that section, the section of nature, we get into the realm of objective spirit. So we have the objectivity of nature, and then we have the objectivity of spirit. This is not about nature as the presupposition of our material being. This is about what we create as human beings. We create a spiritual world that, of course, is also attached to and connected to the material world, but it's actually a construction of the human mind, and it's upheld in actions that are in conformity to a certain category, like the notion of property. And now we're really into social philosophy. That's the doctrine of the objective spirit. The second part of the second part, so in the philosophy of nature, is called subjective spirit. How human beings are actually speaking human beings, understanding human beings, living human beings. That is the final idea of the philosophy of nature. And here we're going to talk about, in social philosophy, about society that human beings create and at the same time are dependent upon for their own lives. That's the whole realm of objective spirit. Now, objective spirit ranges from the what is called the immediacy of rights, let's say the most immediate and simple categories in which and through which we express our social being, like property, like contract, and like the idea of injustice. And then there is a second part to this third part of the encyclopedia, and that is all about the civil society, family, what Hegel calls die Polizei, that is to say, the policing function that gives order to society, that is also part of that. Economic life is part of that. So, what is called the satisfaction of needs. We have to talk about that further on. And then ultimately we come to the great institutions of representation. There's a huge problem in Hegel with these institutions of representation. There's nothing like a parliament or whatever. Hegel is presupposing that the governing bodies in society are linked to, for instance, property, ownership of land. He doesn't envision this later 20th century idea of a democracy, but we need to discuss that problem when we get to it. And ultimately, we get to the state, which is the highest form of objective spirit. And from then on, we go to the final part of the encyclopedia, which is called the absolute spirit, which, according to Hegel, is found in art, the history of art, but also in works of art. Secondly, in religion, which for Hegel, of course, means Christian religion as the highest development of religion. Also, a very important topic to discuss and to be also critical about. Is Hegel right that Christianity is the highest form of religion? We need to talk about that when we get to the absolute spirit, which might take us a year to get there, but that's what we're going to do ultimately. And then finally, philosophy, or maybe philosophy including the speculative sciences. And I mean speculative sciences because they're not limited to experiment and experience of today, but they speculate, not at random, but they speculate about, for instance, the origin of the universe. And so I think philosophy and cosmology, for instance, are indeed very much connected. And I think Hegel is also expressing that idea in that part of the absolute spirit. Okay, this is a very brief introduction to the whole system, and I hope to write a little bit about it so that you can find it.